The mission brief had been clear. No air support available. That's what the SEAL team leader was told when they inserted into the Helmand Valley at 200 hours. Air assets were committed elsewhere, spread thin across 3 provinces, chasing high-value targets that kept disappearing into cave networks like smoke. The 8 operators moved through the poppy fields in practiced silence, night vision turning the world into shades of green and shadow. Their objective was a compound 2 clicks north, where intelligence suggested a Taliban logistics coordinator was meeting with suppliers from across the Pakistan border. Simple grab and go, except nothing in Helmand was ever simple. They were 90 meters from the compound when the first RPG streaked past Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves' head, close enough that he felt the heat wash across his face. The explosion tore through a mud wall behind them, and suddenly the night erupted with muzzle flashes from 3 different positions. They'd walked into a prepared ambush, and the SEAL team went aground behind a low irrigation berm that wouldn't stop anything heavier than rifle rounds. Reeves keyed his radio, voice steady despite the chaos. Broken arrow, broken arrow. Grid November, Quebec 7428. We are danger close, effective enemy fire from multiple positions. Need immediate air support. The response crackled back almost instantly. Shadow 2-1, broken arrow acknowledged, but all air assets are committed. Closest Apache is 40 minutes out. Can you disengage? Reeves looked at his team. They were pinned down completely, taking fire from a tree line to the east, a stone building to the north, and what sounded like a technical with a heavy machine gun somewhere beyond the compound walls. One of his men was already hit, tourniquet applied, still fighting but bleeding through the compression bandage. Disengage wasn't an option. They'd be cut down the moment they moved. Negative on disengage, Reeves transmitted, rounds snapping overhead as he spoke. We are fixed in position, taking sustained fire. We need something now or we're not making it to sunrise. There was a pause on the other end, longer than protocol allowed. Then a different voice came through, female, with a peculiar flatness that Reeves would later recognize as someone who'd already made a decision. Shadow 2-1, this is Hog 1-5. I'm 20 miles south, Winchester on Mavericks, but I've got 300 rounds of 30 Mike and a full fuel load. Send me your coordinates and mark your position. I'm inbound. Reeves exchanged glances with his point man through the darkness. Hog was A-10 callsign, warthogs, and this one was apparently coming alone. The compound's heavy gun was walking fire closer to their position, chewing through the berm with methodical precision. Reeves transmitted the grid coordinates, his GPS laser designator painting an infrared strobe only visible through night vision. Hog 1-5, Shadow 2-1. Marked position is friendly, danger close authorization granted. Enemy positions are 50 meters north, 70 meters east, and we've got a technical approximately 120 meters northwest. How copy? Good copy, Shadow 2-1. I'll be overhead in 90 seconds. Keep your heads down and trust the hog. The radio went silent except for the sound of controlled breathing. Somewhere in the southern darkness, an aircraft was screaming toward them at 350 knots, and none of the SEALs had any idea who was flying it or whether 90 seconds would be fast enough. The technical's heavy gun had found their range now, hammering the berm with 50 cal rounds that sent sprays of dirt across their backs. Reeves' radio man was counting down in his head, marking time by heartbeats and muzzle flashes. Then they heard it. Not the whine of jet engines, but something deeper, a guttural roar that sounded like industrial machinery wrapped in fury. The A-10 Thunderbolt came in so low that its silhouette blotted out stars, twin turbofans mounted high on the fuselage, straight wings extending like the arms of some predatory insect. It wasn't graceful. It was blunt and angular and utterly menacing, designed around a cannon that could shred armor plating. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly as it lined up on the tree line, and for one surreal moment, everything went quiet except for that approaching roar. Then the GAU-8 Avenger opened fire, and the night turned into a continuous thunderclap that Reeves felt in his chest cavity. The 7-barrel rotary cannon spat 30 mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second, each round the size of a beer bottle, moving at nearly 1,000 meters per second. The sound wasn't like machine gun fire. It was a sustained brrrrrt that seemed to tear the air itself apart, a bass-note symphony of destruction that announced the warthog's presence like a war god clearing its throat. The tree line where enemy fighters had been dug and simply disintegrated. Trees exploded into splinters, the ground erupted in geysers of dirt and pulverized vegetation, and bodies that had been firing AK-47s moments before ceased to exist in any meaningful form. They pulled up hard after a 3-second burst, climbing with surprising agility for something that looked like it belonged in a museum of industrial equipment rather than a modern battlefield. The voice came back on the radio, still flat, professional. Shadow 2-1, Hog 1-5, Eastern threat neutralized. Stand by for second pass on northern structure. Reeves was too stunned to respond immediately. The tree line was gone, just gone. Smoke and dust hung in the air where fighters had been coordinating their ambush less than 20 seconds ago. He keyed his mic with shaking hands. Hog 1-5, good hits, good hits. Northern structure still has active shooters. The A-10 was already banking around, impossibly low, using the terrain to mask its approach. Whoever was flying that Hog knew the aircraft's capabilities intimately, keeping the twin engines positioned above the fuselage so that heat seekers would have trouble locking from below, trading speed and altitude for precision and survival. The aircraft came around from the west this time, nose tracking toward the stone building. The Taliban fighters in the compound had realized what was happening and were trying to scatter, running from the building toward vehicles parked behind the walls. They didn't make it. The GAU-8 spoke again, that terrible sustained roar, and the northern structure came apart like it was made of cardboard. Stone blocks became dust, walls collapsed inward, and the running figures dropped mid-stride as 30mm rounds stitched through the courtyard with surgical accuracy. The A-10 pulled up, climbing into the darkness, and the compound fell silent except for crackling flames. Shadow 2-1, northern structure destroyed. I have eyes on your technical, one more pass. The technical had been trying to reposition, its crew apparently realizing that staying still meant death. The truck was racing along a dirt road, bouncing over ruts, its heavy gun pointing skyward but unable to track the A-10's approach vector. Reeves watched through his night vision as the warthog came in from the south, even lower than before, almost skimming the poppy fields. The aircraft's titanium bathtub armor plating designed to protect the pilot from ground fire caught moonlight as it closed distance. This time the burst was shorter, more controlled. The GAU-8 tracked the moving technical with balletic precision, walking 30mm rounds directly through the truck's engine block and up through the cab. The vehicle exploded in a fireball that lit up the valley, ammunition cooking off in secondary detonations that sent tracers spiraling into the night sky. The A-10 climbed away from the fireball, wings rocking slightly, and suddenly the Helmand Valley was quiet except for distant burning and the ringing in 8 SEALs' ears. Reeves finally found his voice. Hog 1-5, Shadow 2-1, all threats neutralized. That was outstanding work. We owe you our lives. There was a pause before the response came, and when it did, Reeves could hear something in the voice that hadn't been there before. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of tired acknowledgement. Shadow 2-1, Hog 1-5, no debt owed. It's what we do. I'm going to orbit overhead until your exfil arrives. Nobody else is touching you tonight. The A-10 circled above them in the darkness, its profile occasionally visible against stars, engines providing a steady rumble that somehow felt reassuring rather than threatening. Reeves looked at his wounded teammate, now stable enough to give a weak thumbs up, then back at the circling aircraft. He'd been in combat for 6 deployments, worked with every kind of air support the military offered, but he'd never seen flying like that. Danger close gun runs in pitch darkness, surgical precision at 50 meters from friendly forces, split-second target discrimination between SEALs and Taliban fighters. Hog 1-5, request pilot identification for our after-action report, Reeves transmitted. That kind of flying deserves proper recognition. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice came back, it carried the same flatness, but underneath it Reeves detected something else. Resignation, maybe, or the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation before. Shadow 2-1, Hog 1-5. Captain Nora Keller, call sign Reaper 6. Serial number I'd rather not broadcast over open channel. You can get the rest from your TOC when you're back. Reaper 6. The call sign struck Reeves as fitting after what he'd just witnessed. Understood, Reaper 6. For what it's worth, that was the finest close air support I've seen in 16 years of doing this job. Appreciate that, Shadow 2-1. Your exfil bird is 12 minutes out. Stay tight. The A-10 continued its lazy orbit, and Reeves settled back against the berm to wait for the helicopter. Around him, his team was conducting post-contact procedures, checking ammunition, treating the wounded man, scanning for secondary threats. But they kept glancing up at that circling shape overhead, the blunt-nosed guardian that had appeared when the book said no air support was available, when the radios said everything was committed elsewhere, when death had been measuring them for size and finding them fitting. Later, much later, after the MH-47 had extracted them and they were back at Kandahar Airfield, Reeves would ask around about Captain Nora Keller. The answers he got were fragmentary, delivered with sidelong glances and lowered voices. She'd been flying Warthogs for 7 years, 3 deployments in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq before that. Some people called her the best A-10 pilot in theater. Others used different terms, less flattering, wrapped in the particular skepticism that seemed to follow female combat pilots like weather. One crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant who'd been turning wrenches on A-10 since the first Gulf War, had been more direct. Captain Keller, yeah, I know her, quiet, keeps to herself. But I'll tell you something, that woman can make a hog dance. I've seen her put rounds through a window at 400 knots. Problem is, she's got something to prove to people who'll never be satisfied, and it's burning her out from the inside. Reeves had filed his after-action report with detailed commendation for Hog 1-5, emphasizing the danger-close work, the life-saving intervention, the exceptional airmanship. He'd done what he could. Then he'd returned to his team and tried not to think about the flatness in that voice, the resignation underneath the professionalism, or the fact that someone who flew like an angel of death apparently still had something to prove. Back at the air station, in a ready room that smelled of jet fuel and stale coffee, Captain Nora Keller was filling out her own mission report. She wrote in precise block letters, responded to troops in contact situation, expended 297 rounds 30 ammunition, 3 enemy positions destroyed, no friendly casualties, aircraft status, code 1. She didn't mention that she'd been returning from a solo patrol, that she'd heard the broken arrow call and diverted without authorization, that her fuel state had been borderline for making the run and still getting back to base. She signed the report, filed it in the appropriate folder, and walked out to look at her aircraft. The A-10 sat on the flight line, ugly and beloved, scorched and patched and utterly lethal. The crew chief was already inspecting the GAU-8, running diagnostics on the feed system. He looked up as she approached. "Good shooting tonight, Captain. Word is you saved a whole SEAL team." Keller nodded once, hands in her flight suit pockets. "The hog did the work. I just pointed it in the right direction." The crew chief smiled slightly, recognizing the deflection for what it was. "That's not what they're saying. They're saying you flew danger close in 0 visibility and didn't miss. They're saying you showed up when nobody else could. They also saying I broke protocol diverting from assigned patrol pattern." Keller's voice was mild, but there was an edge underneath it. The crew chief's smile faded. "Haven't heard that yet, but you know how it goes, ma'am. Do something right and some people will still find the wrong in it. Keller looked at her aircraft, at the smoke stains around the cannon barrel, at the patched bullet holes in the wings from previous missions. The A-10 was old, designed in the 1970s, kept flying through sheer determination, and the fact that nothing else could do what it did. It was ugly, slow, unglamorous. It was also the difference between soldiers going home and soldiers going into body bags. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I know how it goes." She walked back to her quarters alone, past other pilots gathering in the wreck area, past the ops center where mission boards tracked sorties and targets. None of them called out to her. None of them asked about the mission. It had been that way since she'd arrived in theater, and she'd stopped expecting different. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, and she was an outsider despite her flight hours, not because she wasn't good. Because she was too good, and that made people uncomfortable when the person being too good was a woman in a community that had been male-dominated for 40 years. In her quarters, she hung her flight suit on the regulation hook, set her boots in alignment, and lay on her rack staring at the ceiling. Somewhere out in Helmand Valley, 8 SEALs were drinking coffee or writing letters home or sleeping the sleep of men who'd brushed against death and stepped back. They'd remember Reaper 6, probably tell stories about the A-10 that appeared from nowhere and turned the tide. They might even wonder about the pilot behind the call sign. But they'd go on with their lives, and she'd go on with hers, and the distance between those two trajectories would remain as vast as the Afghan sky she'd flown through tonight. That was fine. That was how it worked. She hadn't joined the Air Force to make friends. She'd joined to fly, to make a difference, to matter in some concrete and measurable way. And tonight, for 8 men who'd been seconds from dying in a poppy field, she had mattered. That would have to be enough. The next morning arrived with the usual compound of heat and diesel exhaust. Keller was in the briefing room at 5:30, reviewing weather reports and threat assessments for the day's patrol schedule. The operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Briggs who'd been flying A-10s since she was in elementary school, looked up as she entered. "Keller, good work last night. Heard you pulled a team out of a hot situation." She nodded once, non-committal. They were in a hard spot, happened to be nearby. Briggs' expression was unreadable. Nearby, except your assigned patrol sector was 20 nautical miles east of that position. You diverted off mission. Here it was. Keller kept her voice level professional. "I heard a broken arrow call, sir. Troops in contact, no air support available. I had ordnance and fuel, seemed like the right call." The right call would have been to contact TOC and coordinate through proper channels. "You just went maverick, Captain. That's not how we operate." Keller met his eyes steadily. She'd been through this before, different location, same essential conversation. "With respect, sir, by the time I'd coordinated through channels, those SEALs would have been dead. I made the tactical decision that conditions warranted immediate response." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "And if you'd been shot down, if we'd lost an A-10 and a pilot because you decided to play hero, then I'd have been shot down doing my job, which is close air support for troops in contact. That's why we're here, sir. That's why we fly warthogs." The silence stretched between them. Other pilots had started filtering into the briefing room, conversation dying as they sensed the tension. Briggs finally sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. "Look, Keller, you're a good pilot. Damn good if I'm being honest, but you've got this. This thing where you think you have to prove something every single mission. You take risks nobody else would take. You volunteer for the shit details. You fly like you're invincible, and one day that's going to catch up with you." Keller felt something cold settling in her chest. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Go ahead." "Every pilot in this room takes risks. Every single one. That's the nature of flying close air support in a combat zone. The difference is when I take those risks, people question my judgment. When I volunteer for difficult missions, people say I'm trying to prove something. When I execute successful danger-close runs, people focus on the protocol violation instead of the 8 lives saved. So maybe, sir, the issue isn't that I'm trying to prove something. Maybe the issue is that some people will never be satisfied regardless of what I prove. The briefing room was absolutely silent now. Briggs' face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a senior officer dealing with insubordination that wasn't quite insubordination. That's a serious accusation, Captain. It's an observation, sir, based on 3 deployments and 7 years of service. Keller's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath it. I've never had a mishap, never lost an aircraft, never failed to complete a mission. My safety record is spotless. My effectiveness ratings are in the top percentile, but somehow I'm the one who's taking too many risks and flying reckless. Respectfully, sir, if I were a man with the same record, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Briggs stood up slowly. For a moment, Keller thought he was going to relieve her, ground her, maybe even recommend disciplinary action. Instead, he picked up his briefing folder and headed for the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at her. You're probably right, Captain, and that's a problem we'll have to address. But today, right now, you're scheduled for Patrol Sector Charlie 3. Brief in 15 minutes. Dismissed. He left, and the other pilots gradually followed, filing out in ones and twos. None of them met Keller's eyes. None of them said anything about her confrontation with the ops officer or about last night's mission. She stood alone in the briefing room, surrounded by charts and weather reports and the ghost of a conversation that had been building for years. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the briefing table until they steadied. This was the cost, she thought. The cost of being good at a job people didn't think you should have. The cost of excelling in a community that treated excellence as threat when it came from the wrong source. She could be competent and be tolerated. She could be exceptional and be resented. There was no middle ground. But there was also no going back. She'd committed to this path when she'd signed up for pilot training, when she'd fought for her slot in the A-10 pipeline, when she'd survived 3 deployments worth of subtle and not-so-subtle pressure to be less, do less, aspire to less. The SEALs from last night were alive because she'd been exceptional. The next troops in contact situation would need that same exceptionalism. So she'd keep flying, keep proving, keep being better than anyone thought she had to be, until either they accepted it or she burned out completely. 15 minutes later, she was in Patrol Sector Charlie 3, 5,000 feet above the Kandahar province, scanning ground below through targeting pod displays and visual marks. The radio chatter was routine, other aircraft checking in, ground controllers updating threat matrices, the steady background noise of a war being prosecuted through coordination and communication. She flew her pattern, responsive and alert, waiting for the next crisis that would need an A-10's particular blend of firepower and resilience. It came 4 hours into her patrol. A Marine forward operating base taking mortar fire, enemy spotters on a ridgeline 3 clicks out, danger of overrun if the mortars continued. Keller acknowledged the call, rolled in, and put 200 rounds exactly where they needed to be. The mortars stopped. The Marines held their perimeter, and somewhere in a coordination center, someone marked the mission complete without ever knowing or caring about the pilot behind the call sign. That was fine. That was how it worked. She returned to base, debriefed, filed reports, and prepared for the next day's missions. The routine absorbed her like water, familiar and numbing. Fly, fight, file paperwork. Repeat until deployment ended or something broke, aircraft or pilot, whichever came first. 3 weeks passed. Keller flew 27 more missions, expended 4,000 pounds of ordnance, provided close air support for 17 separate troops in contact situations. She was professional, effective, and utterly alone. The other pilots had stopped trying to include her in after-mission gatherings. She'd stopped expecting invitations. It was easier that way, cleaner. She was here to fly, not to socialize. Then Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves showed up at the air station, 8 SEALs in tow, asking for Captain Nora Keller by name. The operations desk sergeant looked confused. Captain Keller's in her quarters. Can I ask what this is about? Reeves smiled slightly. Just wanted to thank the pilot who saved our lives. Figure we owe her that much. The sergeant's confusion deepened, but he made the call. 20 minutes later, Keller was standing in front of 8 special operations soldiers who tracked her down to say thank you. It was awkward and strange and completely unexpected. She didn't know what to do with gratitude delivered in person, face to face, from men whose names she didn't know, but whose positions she'd memorized through a targeting pod. "You didn't have to come here," she said finally. "I was just doing my job." Reeves shook his head. "No, ma'am. What you did went beyond just doing your job. You showed up when nobody else could, flew danger clothes in conditions that would have grounded most pilots, and put rounds exactly where they needed to be without hitting friendlies 50 meters away. That's not just doing a job. That's artistry." The other SEALs nodded agreement. One of them, the one who'd been wounded that night, stepped forward. "I got a daughter back home, Captain. She's 3 years old. Because of you, I'm going to see her again. That means something." Keller felt something strange happening in her chest, a tightness that might have been emotion if she let it. "I'm glad you're okay, all of you. That's why we fly these missions." They talked for another 10 minutes, the SEALs recounting their perspective of that night, the sound of the GAU-8, the precision of the strikes, the reassurance of having the A-10 overhead until exfil arrived. Keller listened, accepting their gratitude with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else. When they finally left, Reeves paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Captain, you're the kind of pilot that makes the rest of us believe in air support again. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then they were gone and Keller was alone again. But something had shifted, imperceptibly. The SEAL's visit had been witnessed by other pilots, by ground crew, by administrative staff. Word spread the way word always spreads in military communities, quickly, informally, carrying weight because it came from operators with reputations forged in combat. The SEALs thought Reaper 6 was exceptional. The SEALs, who worked with the best air support available, thought she was worth tracking down to thank personally. That meant something, even to pilots who'd been reluctant to acknowledge her capabilities. Not acceptance, exactly. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of recognition that competence doesn't care about the pilot's gender, only about their ability to put ordnance on target when lives hang in the balance. Keller returned to her quarters and found sleep difficult. She kept replaying the conversation, the genuine gratitude in those operators' voices, the wounded SEAL talking about his daughter. This was why she flew, not for recognition or acceptance or to prove anyone wrong. For moments like that, where skill and timing and a willingness to take calculated risks meant the difference between families getting their loved ones back or receiving folded flags. If the cost of those moments was isolation and skepticism and constant pressure to be twice as good for half the recognition, then that was a cost she'd pay. She'd known it would be hard when she started. She just underestimated how many years hard could feel like impossible. But she'd also underestimated how much difference one mission could make. One night in Helmand Valley had become legend, at least in certain circles. The A-10 pilot who appeared when the book said no air was available, who flew danger clothes in darkness, who saved 8 SEALs and then quietly returned to routine patrols like it was nothing special. Stories like that had a way of spreading, of taking on life beyond the original events. Within a week, Keller started noticing different treatment from ground controllers, from maintenance crews, from the support personnel who kept operations running. Not overt no salutes or special attention, but subtle shifts in tone, small gestures of respect, the sense that she was being seen differently than before. It was strange and uncomfortable, and she didn't entirely trust it. Reputation built on a single mission was fragile, dependent on the next mission matching the first. One mistake, one moment of imperfect judgment, and the story would change from exceptional pilot to got lucky once. She knew how these narratives worked. She'd watched male pilots build careers on far less, and she'd watched female pilots have their accomplishments diminished or explained away or attributed to favorable conditions. So she kept her head down and kept flying. Patrol Sector Charlie 3 became as familiar as her own quarters. She learned the terrain like a text, could navigate by terrain features even without GPS, knew which wadis offered cover and which ridgelines held likely observation posts. The A-10 became an extension of her intentions, responsive and reliable, ugly and absolutely lethal when circumstances required. Her deployment was scheduled to end in 6 weeks. 6 more weeks of patrols and close air support and filing reports. Then back to the States, to a training squadron or staff position, to the bureaucratic machinery that turned combat experience into promotion potential and assignments. She tried not to think about it. The future felt distant and uncertain. The present was concrete, fuel states and ordnance loads and radio frequencies. Then came the mission that would redefine everything. Not because it was more dangerous than previous missions, though it was. Not because it required greater skill, though it did. But because it happened during daylight with witnesses, with cameras recording every detail, and with consequences that would ripple far beyond one A-10 pilot and the troops she was supporting. It started with a routine patrol, Sector Charlie 3, weather clear, visibility unlimited. Keller was 3 hours into a 4-hour patrol when the emergency call came through on guard frequency, the emergency channel monitored by all aircraft. The voice was tight with controlled panic, a JTAC Joint Terminal Attack controller embedded with an Army Ranger element that had been ambushed while conducting a census operation in a village outside Kandahar. Any aircraft, this is Sabre 26. Troops in contact, Grid Papa Quebec 8512. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions, 2 urgent casualties, requesting immediate close air support. We are danger close, enemy within 30 meters of friendly positions. Keller was already banking toward the coordinates before the transmission finished. Sabre 26, Hog 15, I'm 8 miles south, 2 minutes out. Send detailed situation. The JTAC's voice came back, steadier now that air support was responding. Hog 15, Sabre 26. We're a 12-man element pinned in a compound, taking fire from a market complex to our north and residential buildings east and west. Civilians are in the area. Danger close doesn't begin to cover it. We've got wounded who need medevac, but we can't break contact to establish an LZ. 30 meters between friendlies and enemies. Civilians in the area. Multiple firing positions in urban terrain. This was the nightmare scenario for close air support, the situation where any mistake meant friendly casualties or dead civilians, where the margin for error was measured in single-digit meters. Most pilots would have requested additional assets, coordinated with higher command, maybe even declined the mission as too risky. Keller pushed the throttles forward and dropped altitude. Sabre 26, Hog 15, I copy all. Mark your position with IR strobe, I'll be overhead in 60 seconds. Be ready to talk me onto targets with extreme precision. Roger that, Hog 15. Marking position now. Hog, I need you to understand we've got women and children in these structures. This needs to be surgical. Understood, Sabre 26. I'll make it surgical. The village appeared ahead, sprawling collection of compounds and market stalls clustered around irrigation channels. Keller could see muzzle flashes even from 2 miles out, could see the Ranger's compound by the IR strobe flickering on her targeting pod. The tactical picture assembled itself in her mind with practiced speed. Rangers pinned in L-shaped compound, market complex 50 meters north with fighters moving between stalls, residential buildings flanking east and west with shooters in windows and on rooftops. She came in from the south, low enough that villagers could count the rivets on her fuselage, the A-10's distinctive profile impossible to mistake. The appearance of the Warthog had immediate effect, firing from the market complex intensified as fighters tried to bring her down, tracers arcing up toward her aircraft. The titanium bathtub protecting her cockpit was rated to withstand 23 mm rounds. These were rifle calibers, dangerous but not immediately lethal to the aircraft. Sabre 26, Hog 15 is overhead. I have visual on your position and enemy muzzle flashes in the market area, confirming no civilians in market complex. Negative, Hog 15. Civilians have cleared the market, but they're in buildings all around it. You need to keep your fire contained to the market stalls only. Keller zoomed her targeting pod, identifying individual fighters moving between stalls, tracking their positions, calculating angles of fire that would keep 30 mm rounds within the market footprint and prevent overpenetration into residential areas. It was complex geometry at 400 knots, requiring instant processing of ballistics, trajectory, aircraft attitude, and target movement. Sabre 26, Hog 15 is rolling in on market complex. Danger close, keep your people down. She came in from the west, wings level, nose depressed slightly, targeting reticle centered on the northern edge of the market where the densest concentration of muzzle flashes originated. Her finger rested on the trigger, waiting for the precise moment when geometry and ballistics and aircraft position aligned perfectly. The moment came. She pressed. The GAU-8 roared 65 rounds per second, a 3-second burst that sounded like the sky tearing apart. The market complex erupted in dust and debris as 30mm rounds walked through fighting positions with mechanical precision. Keller pulled up hard, banking right, already looking for the next threat. Behind her, the market was silent. Ahead, muzzle flashes continued from the eastern residential building. Sabre 26, Hog 15, market threat neutralized. I have fire from the eastern building, second floor, 2 windows. Civilian status. Hog 15, civilians are in that building, ground floor and third floor. Second floor is hostile only. Can you hit just the second floor windows? It was an absurd request, technically. She was flying a plane built around a cannon designed to destroy Soviet tanks, being asked to conduct counter-sniper work in urban terrain. But the alternative was leaving Rangers pinned down while wounded men bled out. She thought about the SEAL with the 3-year-old daughter, about all the families waiting for soldiers who might not come home because the air support couldn't be precise enough. Sabre 26, Hog 15. I can hit the second floor. Mark the building with laser for confirmation. The JTAC's laser designator painted the eastern building, and Keller's targeting pod locked onto it, identifying the 2 windows on the second floor where muzzle flashes strobed in the shadows. She came around from the north this time, approaching perpendicular to the building face, angle calculated to ensure rounds entering the second floor windows wouldn't penetrate through to the ground floor where civilians sheltered. Sabre 26, confirm civilians are on ground floor below the target windows. Affirmative, Hog 15, ground floor only. Second floor windows are clear to engage. This was beyond danger close. This was threading a needle at 400 knots with a weapon system designed for area effects, not precision sniping. Keller steadied her breathing, waiting for the perfect moment. The A-10's flight path stabilized. The targeting reticle settled on the leftmost window. She fired a 1-second burst 20 rounds and immediately adjusted to the second window, another 1-second burst. Both windows exploded inward, the second floor of the eastern building suddenly silent. Keller pulled up, circling to assess. No muzzle flashes from the eastern building, no rounds coming from the market. The only remaining threat was the western building, and even as she looked, white cloth appeared in its windows, improvised surrender flags. Sabre 26, Hog 15. Eastern threat neutralized, western position is surrendering. You're clear to establish medevac LZ. The JTAC's voice came back, audibly shaken. Hog 15, Sabre 26. I've been doing this job for 4 years and I've never seen flying like that. Those were perfect shots. Perfect. How the hell did you thread 30 Mike through second-story windows without hitting civilians? Keller didn't answer immediately. She was busy scanning for secondary threats, checking fuel state, ensuring the tactical picture remained stable. When she finally responded, her voice carried the same flatness it always did. Sabre 2-6, it's what we train for. Get your wounded evacuated. I'll maintain overhead cover until medevac arrives. She orbited the village for another 20 minutes, watching Rangers extract their casualties, watching the medevac helicopter land and depart, watching the tactical situation stabilize from crisis to controlled aftermath. The whole mission had lasted 18 minutes from first contact to final resolution. 18 minutes that would be reviewed, analyzed, and discussed for months afterward. Because unlike the Helmand Valley mission, this one had been observed. The Rangers had helmet cameras. The JTAC had been filming with a handheld for his own after-action documentation. Drones overhead had captured the whole engagement from multiple angles. And what those recordings showed was something that seemed to defy the capabilities of the weapons system involved. An A-10 Warthog, flying repeated danger-close passes, putting 30mm cannon rounds through specific windows in buildings surrounded by civilians, neutralizing threats with surgical precision that most people associated with guided missiles rather than rotating cannons. The footage went up the chain of command and then sideways, spreading through military channels with the viral momentum of something truly exceptional. Here was proof, incontrovertible and documented, that Reaper 6 wasn't just good. She was operating at a level that redefined what people thought A-10s could do in urban environments. Keller knew none of this when she landed. She debriefed, filed her reports, and gone to her quarters expecting the usual routine. She was surprised when Lieutenant Colonel Briggs showed up at her door 2 hours later, tablet in hand, expression unreadable. "Captain Keller, we need to talk about your mission this morning." Here we go, she thought. Another conversation about protocol, about risk, about whether she'd been too aggressive or too creative or too willing to push boundaries. She straightened to attention. "Yes, sir." Briggs held up the tablet showing drone footage of her gun runs. "I've been flying A-10s for 22 years, Captain. I've trained hundreds of pilots. I've flown in 3 separate conflicts, and I've never seen anyone do what you did this morning. Threading cannon rounds through second-story windows, in urban terrain, with civilians in the building. That shouldn't be possible." "It was within the aircraft's capabilities, sir. I calculated the angles, confirmed civilian positions, and executed with appropriate precision." "Appropriate precision," Briggs repeated, something like wonder in his voice. "Captain, you just redefined what appropriate precision means for close air support. The Ranger commander is calling you the best CAS pilot he's ever worked with. The JTAC says you did things with a 30mm cannon that he wouldn't trust to a Hellfire missile. And the footage. Keller, this is going to change things." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Briggs sat down heavily in her desk chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Few weeks back I questioned your judgment, said you were trying to prove something. I was wrong. You're not trying to prove anything. You're just that good. And I couldn't see it because I was looking through assumptions I didn't know I had." Keller stood very still, afraid that moving would break whatever moment this was. "Sir, Let me finish, Captain, please." Briggs looked up at her, and his expression was something she'd never seen before from him, respect unqualified and genuine. "The military is changing, has to change. We need the best pilots in the cockpits, period. Not the best male pilots or the pilots who fit traditional profiles, just the best. And you're the best A-10 pilot I've ever seen fly. That makes everything else irrelevant." He stood up, extending his hand. Keller shook it, still processing. Briggs smiled slightly. "Your deployment ends in 6 weeks. Before you leave theater, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for the Helmand Valley mission and today's action. I'm also recommending you for weapons school when you rotate back. We need instructors who can teach this level of flying. You interested? Weapons School. The Air Force's graduate-level training program for combat aviation, where the best pilots went to become even better and then returned as instructors. It was career-defining, prestigious, and Keller had never even considered it might be an option for her. Yes, sir, she managed, very interested. Good, I'll start the paperwork. Dismissed, Captain, and Keller. Thank you for making me reconsider some things I should have questioned years ago. He left and Keller sat on her rack, hands shaking again but for different reasons. Recognition, validation, the sense that maybe, finally, competence was being judged on its own terms rather than through the filter of gender bias and skepticism. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither, just sat there processing the impossible reality that things might actually be changing. The remaining 6 weeks of her deployment passed in a blur. The footage from the village engagement continued spreading, generating discussions about A-10 capabilities, about close air support doctrine, about what was possible when pilot skill matched aircraft capabilities. Keller flew her remaining missions with the same professional competence she always had, but now, when she returned to base, other pilots wanted to talk about techniques, about how she calculated angles for urban gun runs, about her thought process during danger-close situations. It was strange and uncomfortable and gradually less isolating. She started accepting invitations to post-mission debriefs, started sharing knowledge that she'd kept private because nobody had seemed interested before. The community that had held her at arm's length began, slowly, to recognize that she had things to teach, perspectives that came from flying differently, because she'd had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. By the time her deployment ended, Keller had flown 73 combat missions, expended over 20,000 pounds of ordnance, and provided close air support for 41 troops in contact situations. She'd saved lives in quantities she couldn't calculate, changed perceptions in ways she was only beginning to understand, and survived 3 deployments in a combat zone that had broken aircraft and pilots alike. The flight back to the States was long and gave her too much time to think about what came next, about weapons school and whether she could succeed there, about whether the recognition she'd earned would persist or fade once she was out of combat zones and back in training environments where prejudices had different, subtler forms. But she also thought about the SEAL with the 3-year-old daughter, about the Rangers who'd needed surgical precision and gotten it, about all the soldiers who'd gone home because an ugly aircraft and a determined pilot had been in the right place when everything else was going wrong. That mattered more than recognition or career advancement or proving anyone wrong. She joined to fly to make a difference to matter, and she had. That would have to be enough regardless of what came next. Weapons school turned out to be both harder and easier than she'd expected. Harder because the standards were genuinely demanding, the instruction intensive, the expectation that she'd absorb complex tactical theory while maintaining flight proficiency. Easier because for the first time in her career, she was in an environment where skill was the only currency that mattered. The instructors didn't care about her gender. They cared whether she could execute tactical problems, whether she understood weapons employment theory, whether she could teach what she knew to others. She could. She graduated 3rd in her class, earned her weapons school patch, and was assigned as an A-10 instructor at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Teaching suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Breaking down complex maneuvers into teachable components, watching younger pilots develop competence, seeing the moment when theory clicked into practical application, it was satisfying in entirely different ways than combat flying. Her reputation had preceded her. Students knew about Helmand Valley, about the village engagement, about Reaper 6 and the impossible gun runs. Some of them were skeptical initially, expecting the stories to be exaggerated. Then they flew with her, watched her demonstrate techniques, saw firsthand the level of precision she demanded from herself and expected from them. The skepticism faded quickly. Years passed. Keller progressed through ranks and assignments, always returning to the A-10, always finding ways to stay connected to the ugly aircraft that had defined her career. She watched the Air Force slowly, incrementally, become more accepting of female combat pilots, watched barriers fall and opportunities expand, and younger women enter cockpits without facing quite the same level of skepticism she'd endured. It wasn't perfect, progress never was, but it was progress measurable and real. And sometimes, late at night, she'd think about that Helmand Valley mission, about the decision to divert from her patrol pattern, about the moment she'd committed to a danger-close gun run in darkness with no backup and minimal coordination. It had been risky, probably stupid, definitely against protocol. It had also been exactly right, the kind of decision that saved lives because someone was willing to trust their training and their aircraft and their ability to execute under impossible conditions. She'd do it again without hesitation. That was what it meant to fly close air support, to be there when troops needed you, to bring the firepower that made the difference between survival and catastrophe, to make the ugly aircraft dance with surgical grace when seconds mattered and mistakes meant casualties. The A-10 was old now, scheduled for retirement multiple times and reprieved because nothing else could fill its role. Keller understood the feeling. She wasn't young anymore either, wasn't the captain fighting for recognition. But she was still flying, still teaching, still making a difference in ways that mattered. And sometimes, at airshows or ceremonies or chance encounters, she'd meet soldiers who'd been in Helmand or Kandahar, who'd called for close air support and gotten an A-10, who'd survived because someone showed up when the book said no air was available. They'd thank her, sometimes not even knowing she was the pilot behind the call sign they remembered. She'd accept their gratitude with the same quiet professionalism she'd always had, deflecting credit to the aircraft and the community and the mission. But privately, she knew the truth. The aircraft mattered, the community mattered, the mission mattered. But so did the pilot, the individual making split-second decisions in darkness or daylight, threading needles with weapons designed for broader effects, showing up when showing up was the difference between soldiers going home or not. She'd shown up, again and again, deployment after deployment, mission after mission. And in the end, that was the legacy that mattered most, not the medals or the recognition or the barriers broken, but the simple fact that when it counted, when lives hung in the balance, Reaper 6 had been there. And the soldiers who needed her had gone home.